I used to believe that some dreams belong only to younger people, dreams that require courage, dreams that require time, dreams that require starting from zero. And when you are over 50, people quietly assume those dreams are no longer meant for you. At least, that is what I believed for most of my life. If you had asked me a few years ago what my future looked like, my answer would have been simple, predictable, safe, and honestly, a little small. I thought my life had already chosen its final shape: work, family, bills, responsibilities. A comfortable routine that did not change very much from year to year. Nothing was wrong with that life. In fact, many people would probably say it was a good life. I had a stable job. I had a house that was finally paid off after many long years. My children were grown and building their own lives. From the outside, everything looked settled, complete, finished. But sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, I would sit alone in the living room, and a strange question would appear in my mind. A question I did not ask anyone else. A question I barely admitted to myself. Is this really the end of discovering who I can become? It was not a loud question, it was soft, almost like a whisper. But it kept returning, again and again. For most of my adult life, I had been busy taking care of things. Taking care of my children, taking care of my parents when they grew older, taking care of work, deadlines, schedules, responsibilities. Life was full. But somewhere along the way, I stopped asking what I wanted to try, not because anyone told me to stop, but because time moved so quickly that I forgot the question even existed. When you are young, people often ask you what your dreams are. Teachers ask, friends ask, family asks. Everyone seems curious about your future. But something interesting happens when you reach your 40s, and then your 50s. People stop asking. They assume you have already decided everything. Your path is already chosen. Your story is already written. And maybe that assumption slowly becomes part of how you see yourself. I remember one afternoon that changed everything. It was an ordinary Tuesday. Nothing special was planned. I had taken the day off work because I needed to renew my driver's license. After finishing the paperwork, I decided to walk around the small downtown area near the office. It was a sunny day, warm but not too hot. People were moving slowly along the sidewalks. Some were drinking coffee. Some were reading books outside small cafes. I had no real destination. I was simply walking. That was when I passed a small art studio. I had walked by that building many times before, but for some reason, that day I stopped. Inside the window, there were paintings hanging on white walls, bright colors, soft colors, paintings of landscapes, paintings of quiet streets, paintings of ordinary moments that suddenly looked beautiful. I stood there longer than I expected. Something about those paintings made me feel calm, but it also made me feel something else, something I had not felt in a very long time: curiosity. Then I noticed a small sign near the door, and it said, "Beginner Painting Class, Thursday evenings, no experience needed." I almost laughed, not in a cruel way, more like a surprised laugh. Painting? At my age? The idea felt almost ridiculous. I had never taken an art class in my life, not in school, not in college, not at any time. I had always told people I was not the creative type. Numbers made sense to me, schedules made sense to me, budgets made sense to me. But art? Art felt mysterious, unpredictable, maybe even a little intimidating. I stood there looking at the sign, then I looked around the street. People were passing by, busy with their own lives. No one was paying attention to me. But inside my mind, a quiet conversation had started. A voice said, "You are too old to start something like that." Another voice answered, "But why?" The first voice continued, "You will probably be the oldest person in the class." The second voice replied, "So what?" The first voice tried again, "You might be terrible at it." The second voice said something I did not expect. "Maybe. But when was the last time you allowed yourself to be bad at something new?" That question stayed with me because the truth was, I could not remember. When we are children, we try new things all the time: drawing, music, sports, languages, and we are often not very good at them. But that does not stop us, because trying is part of learning. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, many of us stop giving ourselves permission to be beginners. We only do things we already know how to do, things we are comfortable doing, things that feel safe. Standing there on the sidewalk, looking at that small sign in the window, I realized something surprising. I had not been a beginner at anything for decades. My life had become very efficient, very organized, very predictable, but maybe a little too predictable. I continued walking that afternoon, but the image of that sign stayed in my mind. Beginner painting class, no experience needed. The words felt simple, but they also felt strangely powerful. For the rest of the day, I kept thinking about it. While I was cooking dinner, while I was washing dishes, while I was watching television later that evening, the idea kept returning. Painting, learning something new, trying something that had nothing to do with work or responsibilities, something just for me. And yet another voice kept whispering the same familiar sentence. It's too late. Too late to start. Too late to learn. Too late to change anything. But late that night, sitting quietly in my living room, I asked myself a different question. What if too late is simply a story we tell ourselves? What if life still has chapters we have not read yet? What if there are still parts of ourselves waiting to be discovered, even after 50? I did not have the answers that night, but for the first time in many years, I felt something unexpected, a small spark of possibility. And that spark began with something very simple: a sign in a window, a beginner class, and a quiet thought that would not leave my mind. Maybe my story was not finished after all. The idea should have disappeared after a few days. That is usually what happens with small, unrealistic thoughts. They arrive suddenly. They make you curious for a moment. And then life continues, and the idea quietly fades away. But this idea did not disappear. It stayed. The next morning while I was making coffee, the thought returned. Painting class. I tried to ignore it. I told myself there were many reasons why it was not a good idea. The class was on Thursday evenings. Thursday evenings were usually my quiet nights at home. After a long workday, I like to cook something simple, sit on the couch, and watch television. Why change that routine now? Then another thought appeared. What if the routine is exactly the reason you should try? I shook my head and laughed softly at myself. It was strange. For years, I had been a practical person, someone who made decisions quickly and logically. But this time, something emotional had entered the conversation: curiosity. And curiosity is difficult to silence once it wakes up. Later that afternoon, while I was at work, I opened my computer during lunch break. Almost without thinking, I searched for the art studio. It was easy to find. The website looked simple, friendly. There were photos of people sitting around large tables with canvases and brushes. Some paintings looked impressive. Others looked very beginner, uneven shapes, colors that did not always match, brush strokes that were uncertain. And yet, everyone in the photos looked relaxed. Some were laughing. Some were concentrating quietly. One photo caught my attention. It showed a group of students standing near a wall covered with their paintings. Each painting was completely different. Different colors, different styles, different levels of skill. But something about that wall felt beautiful, not because the paintings were perfect, but because they were honest. Each one showed someone trying. At the bottom of the page, there was a short description: Thursday evening beginner class. All materials provided. No experience necessary. Ages 18 to 80 welcome. I read that last line twice. Ages 18 to 80 welcome. 80. That number surprised me. Suddenly, 52 did not feel so old. But even then, another thought quickly arrived. Just because you can go doesn't mean you should. I closed the website. I returned to work. For the rest of the afternoon, I focused on spreadsheets and emails. But something inside my mind had already shifted. That small possibility was now real. A class existed. Real people attended it. People older than me might even be there. Still, doubt remained. That evening, my daughter called me. We spoke about normal things: her job, her apartment, her plans for the weekend. Then she asked a simple question: "What did you do today?" Without planning to say it, I told her about the art studio, about the painting class, about the sign in the window. I expected her to laugh, or maybe politely change the subject. Instead, and there was a moment of silence on the phone. Then she said something that surprised me. "That sounds amazing." I smiled. Amazing? I'm 52. I've never painted anything in my life. She laughed gently. That's exactly why it sounds amazing. I could hear the excitement in her voice. You should try it. I immediately gave my list of practical reasons. I'm busy. I probably won't be good at it. I might be the oldest person there. My daughter listened patiently. And then she said something that stayed with me long after the call ended. "Mom, when I was a kid, you always told me something important." I waited. "You told me it's okay to try things even if you're not sure you'll succeed." I felt quiet for a moment. She continued. "You told me learning something new is never a waste of time." I recognized those words. They were my words, things I had said many times while raising my children, encouraging them to be brave, encouraging them to explore, encouraging them not to be afraid of failure. Now my daughter gently returned that same advice to me. "So maybe," she said softly, "it's your turn to listen to your own advice." After we hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house was quiet again, but the silence felt different now. Instead of doubt, there was reflection. It was strange how easily we encourage other people to be brave, but when it comes to ourselves, we become cautious, careful, protective of our comfort, protective of our image. What if I looked foolish? What if everyone else painted beautifully and my canvas looked like a child's drawing? The thought made me smile nervously. But then another thought appeared. What if no one cared? What if everyone in that room was simply learning? The more I thought about it, the more I realized something important. Most adults stop trying new things not because they cannot learn, but because they are afraid of feeling embarrassed. Children do not worry about embarrassment. They draw freely. They sing loudly. They try and fail and try again. Adults, however, often protect themselves from situations where they might look inexperienced. But standing in my quiet kitchen that night, I began to see something clearly. Maybe embarrassment is a small price to pay for growth. Maybe learning always requires a little discomfort, and maybe that discomfort is not something to avoid. Maybe it is something to welcome. 2 days later, it was Wednesday. The painting class would happen the next evening. All day, I tried not to think about it. But around 4 in the afternoon, my curiosity returned once again. Before I could change my mind, I opened the website again. My heart beat a little faster this time. There was a button on the page. Register for Thursday class. I stared at it. For a long moment, I did nothing. My mind filled with questions. Should I really do this? Is this silly? Is this unnecessary? Then I asked myself one simple question. What is the worst thing that could happen? The answer was surprisingly small. Maybe I would not enjoy the class. Maybe I would decide painting was not for me. Maybe I would never return. But even that would not be a failure, because I would still have tried. And suddenly, trying felt more important than succeeding. So I took a slow breath, moved the mouse, and clicked the button. The registration form appeared. Name, email, phone number, a few simple questions. My hands felt strangely nervous as I typed. When I finished, there was one final button at the bottom. Confirm registration. I paused again. For years, my life had followed familiar patterns, predictable choices, safe routines. But that small button represented something different. A step into the unknown, a step into being a beginner again. And maybe a step toward discovering a part of myself I had forgotten. I looked at the screen one more time. Then, before doubt could speak again, I clicked. Registration confirmed. Thursday evening. Painting class. Age 52. A new chapter had quietly begun. Thursday arrived faster than I expected. All day at work. I tried to behave as if nothing unusual was happening. I answered emails. I attended meetings. I finished a report that had been waiting on my desk for 3 days. From the outside, it looked like a completely ordinary day. But inside my mind, something felt different. Every time I checked the clock, I realized the painting class was getting closer. At noon, I almost convinced myself not to go. A very reasonable voice appeared in my head. You had a long week. You deserve to rest tonight. You can try something new another time. Those excuses sounded logical, comfortable, safe, but another voice gently reminded me of something important. You already registered. You already decided to try. So after work, instead of driving directly home like I usually did, I drove toward the small downtown street where the art studio was located. The sky was beginning to turn orange as the sun slowly moved toward the horizon. Evening traffic moved slowly. Cars stopped and started at each red light. The closer I got to the studio, the more nervous I felt. Not a terrible kind of nervous, just a quiet tension in my chest, like the feeling you get before doing something unfamiliar. When I finally parked my car, I sat there for a moment with the engine off. Through the window, I could see the studio across the street. The same window, the same paintings on the wall, the same door with the small sign. Beginner painting class, Thursday evenings. For a brief moment, I considered driving away. No one knew I was here. No one would notice if I simply went home. But then I remembered something my daughter had said. Maybe it's your turn to listen to your own advice. I smiled quietly to myself. Then I opened the car door. The evening air felt cool and fresh. I crossed the street slowly and walked toward the studio. The closer I got, the more clearly I could see inside. There were long wooden tables arranged in a circle. Each table had small jars filled with paintbrushes, colorful tubes of paint, white canvases waiting quietly on small stands. The room smelled faintly of paint and wood. Warm yellow lights made the space feel welcoming. Through the window, I saw a few people already sitting at the tables. Some were talking softly. Some were simply looking around the room. They looked normal, not professional artists, just regular people. And that realization helped my nervousness a little. I opened the door. A small bell above it made a gentle sound. Everyone looked up for a moment. My instinct was to apologize for being late, even though the class had not started yet. A woman standing near the center of the room smiled warmly. "You must be here for the beginner class." Her voice was calm and friendly. "Yes," I said, suddenly feeling shy. "I'm glad you came," she said. "I'm Anna, the instructor." She walked toward me and offered a handshake. Her hands were covered with small spots of colorful paint. That detail made me smile immediately. It felt real, natural. "First time painting?" she asked. "Yes," I admitted. "Perfect," she said with a gentle laugh. "That means you'll have no bad habits." The room chuckled softly. Her humor relaxed me instantly. She showed me to an empty seat at one of the tables. There were about 10 students in the room. A young man who looked like he might be in his 20s, two women who appeared close to my age, an older couple sitting side by side, a middle-aged man wearing a business suit who looked slightly nervous, just like I felt. Suddenly, I realized something important. Everyone here was a beginner. Everyone here had chosen to try something new. Anna clapped her hands softly to get everyone's attention. "Welcome, everyone," she said. "And I'm very happy you're here tonight." She looked around the room with a relaxed smile. "This class is not about perfection." A few people nodded immediately. "It's not about becoming professional artists." A few quiet laughs followed. "It's about enjoying the process of creating something with your own hands." She paused and looked at the blank canvases in front of us. "Tonight, we're going to paint something simple." She walked to the front of the room and placed a small photograph on a table. It showed a peaceful landscape, a lake, a line of trees, a soft sunset sky. "We'll take it step by step," she explained. "No one needs to rush." Then she said something that made the entire room relax even more. "And remember, paint can always be painted over." The students laughed again. Mistakes were allowed, maybe even expected. Anna began explaining the first steps: how to hold the brush, how to mix two colors together, how to gently move the brush across the canvas. Her instructions were slow and clear, very patient. At first, my hands felt awkward. The brush felt unfamiliar. When I tried to paint the first part of the sky, the colors spread unevenly across the canvas. I frowned slightly. It did not look like the photo at all. For a moment, the old voice returned. "See? You're not good at this." But before that thought could grow stronger, Anna walked by my table. She looked at my canvas and smiled. "That's a beautiful start," she said. I looked at her, surprised. "Really?" She nodded. "Painting is not about copying exactly what you see." She pointed gently to the canvas. "It's about interpreting it." That word stayed in my mind. Interpreting. Maybe my painting did not need to look identical to the example. Maybe it just needed to be honest. Around the room, I noticed everyone working quietly. Some paintings looked very different from others. Some skies were darker, some lakes were brighter, some trees leaned in unexpected directions. But something about the room felt peaceful. No competition, no pressure. Just people learning, trying, creating. As the evening continued, something interesting began to happen inside me. The nervousness slowly disappeared. Time moved differently. My mind focused only on the colors, the brush, the movement of my hand across the canvas. I stopped worrying about whether the painting looked perfect. I simply enjoyed the act of painting. For the first time in a very long time, I felt completely present in the moment, not thinking about work, not thinking about responsibilities, just painting. When the class finally ended, nearly 2 hours had passed, but it felt much shorter. Anna encouraged us to place our paintings against the wall so everyone could see them. I hesitated. My paintings still looked imperfect, but slowly I carried my canvas to the wall like everyone else, and something wonderful happened. No two paintings looked the same, not one. The same lake, the same trees, the same sunset, but 10 completely different interpretations, some simple, some bold, some soft, some bright. And suddenly, I felt something I had not expected: pride. Not because my painting was the best, but because it existed, because I had tried, because I had allowed myself to be a beginner again. As I looked at the wall of paintings, I realized something surprising. Starting something new at 52 did not feel embarrassing. It felt alive. And for the first time in years, I wondered something exciting. What else might still be waiting for me to try? That night, when I carried my painting back to the car, I felt strangely light. The canvas was still slightly wet, and I held it carefully with both hands as if it were something fragile. In a way, it was fragile. Not because of the paint, but because of what it represented. A small decision, a small step, but a step that had taken me outside the quiet boundaries I had built around my life. When I placed the painting on the back seat and sat down behind the steering wheel, I did not start the car immediately. Instead, I looked at the studio window one more time. Inside, Anna was cleaning brushes at the sink. A few students were still talking and laughing near the tables. The room looked warm and peaceful. For a moment, I realized something simple but important. 2 hours earlier, I had been nervous about walking through that door. Now, I felt grateful that I did. The drive home felt different from my usual evenings. The streets looked the same. The traffic lights changed from red to green like always. But inside my mind, something had shifted. It was not a dramatic change. Not the kind that makes you suddenly feel like a completely new person. It was quieter than that, more subtle, but it was real. I had done something unfamiliar, and instead of feeling foolish, I felt curious. Curious about what might happen next. When I arrived home, the house was quiet as usual. I carried the canvas inside and leaned it carefully against the kitchen wall. For a few minutes, I simply stood there looking at it. The sunset colors were uneven. The lake was slightly crooked. The trees looked a little uncertain, but I smiled because that painting told a story, not a story about art, a story about courage, the courage to try something without knowing the result, the courage to be imperfect, the courage to begin again. The next morning, when sunlight came through the kitchen window, it landed directly on the canvas. The colors looked brighter in the daylight. For a moment, and I stood there with my coffee and studied it again. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of judging the painting, I noticed something else. I remembered the feeling of painting it, the quiet focus, the slow movement of the brush, the calm in my mind. It reminded me of something many adults forget. Learning can be joyful, not stressful, not competitive, simply joyful. Later that day at work, I told one of my coworkers about the class. He looked surprised. "You? Painting?" he said with a smile. I laughed. "Yes, me." "How was it?" I thought for a moment before answering. "It was peaceful." He nodded slowly. Then he said something interesting. "I've always wanted to try photography," he admitted, "but I never really started." His voice sounded thoughtful, almost like he was speaking more to himself than to me. In that moment, I realized something. Many adults carry small dreams quietly inside them, dreams that seem too small to talk about, or too late to begin. Learning an instrument, writing a story, planting a garden, taking dance lessons, studying a new language. But those ideas often remain in the background of life, waiting, sometimes for years, sometimes for decades. That evening, I received a message from my daughter. "How was the class?" she asked. I sent her a photo of the painting. Her response came quickly. "I love it." I smiled when I read the message. Then she added another sentence. "So, are you going back next week?" I looked at the canvas again. The thought had already crossed my mind earlier that day. Going back, continuing, learning more. But the answer felt natural now. Not scary, not strange, just simple. "Yes," I typed. "I think I will." Over the next few days, something interesting continued to happen. I began noticing creativity in small places around me. The colors of the sky during sunset, the shapes of trees in the park, reflections in windows. It was as if my eyes had quietly opened to details I had ignored for years, not because the world had changed, but because my attention had changed. Trying something new had awakened curiosity again, and curiosity has a wonderful way of expanding your world. The following Thursday arrived, and I returned to the studio. This time, walking through the door felt easier. Familiar faces greeted me. The young man from the first class waved hello. The older couple smiled warmly. Anna welcomed everyone back. Once again, the tables filled with paint and brushes. Once again, blank canvases waited patiently. But this time, I felt different. Less nervous, more excited. I was still a beginner, but now I understood something important. Being a beginner is not a weakness. It is a doorway into learning, growth, discovery, and maybe even joy. As the class began, Anna said something that stayed with me long after that evening ended. "Every artist you admire," she told us, "once stood exactly where you are standing now." She pointed gently at the blank canvases. "At the beginning." The beginning. Those words echoed in my mind, because for many years I had believed something that was not entirely true. I believed life had a clear timeline. Learn when you are young, work when you're older, and eventually settle into routines that no longer change. But sitting in that art studio at 52 years old, holding a paintbrush for the second time in my life, I realized something beautiful. Beginnings are not limited to youth. They can happen at 40, at 50, at 60, even later. Life does not close the door on curiosity unless we close it ourselves. That small painting class did not transform my entire life overnight, but it gave me something valuable, a reminder, a reminder that growth does not have an expiration date. And sometimes, all it takes to open a new chapter is the courage to walk through a door you once believed was not meant for you. Weeks passed, and Thursday evenings slowly became one of my favorite parts of the week. At first, the painting class felt like a small experiment, something I tried simply to see what would happen. But little by little, it became something more meaningful. Not because I suddenly became a great artist, that did not happen. In fact, many of my paintings were still very simple. Sometimes the colors did not blend the way I expected. Sometimes the shapes looked slightly strange. But none of that bothered me anymore, because the real value of those evenings was not the paintings. It was the experience of learning, of growing, of allowing myself to step outside the quiet routine that had shaped my life for so long. Each week, Anna introduced something new. Different brush techniques, different ways to mix colors, different ways to look at light and shadow. At first, I thought painting was simply about copying what you see, but I slowly discovered something deeper. Painting is about observation, about slowing down enough to truly notice the world. One evening, Anna asked us to paint a simple object placed in the center of the table, a small glass jar filled with water. Nothing extraordinary, just a jar. But when we looked closely, the jar became something more interesting. Light reflected through the glass. Tiny shadows appeared on the table. The water inside created soft distortions. The ordinary object suddenly looked complex and beautiful. As I painted that jar, I realized something surprising. For years, I had rushed through my days without truly observing the small details around me. Life had become efficient, but perhaps a little too fast. Painting forced me to slow down, to look carefully, to notice things I had once ignored. And that habit slowly began to follow me outside the studio. When I walked through the park, I noticed the way sunlight moved through the leaves. When I drove home in the evening, I paid attention to the colors of the sky. When rain fell on the windows, I watched the small patterns formed by the drops. None of these moments were dramatic, but they made everyday life feel richer, more alive. One night after class, as we were cleaning our brushes, Anna asked a simple question. Why did each of you decide to join this class? One by one, people shared their stories. The young man in his 20s said he wanted a break from the stress of university. The older couple explained they had recently retired and wanted to try something creative together. The man in the business suit admitted he needed a hobby that had nothing to do with work. Then Anna looked at me. "And you?" she asked gently. I thought for a moment before answering. At first, I joined because I was curious, I said. But now, I think I joined because I needed to remember something. The room became quiet. "What did you need to remember?" Anna asked. I smiled softly. "That life is not finished teaching us." Several people nodded, because perhaps many of us had forgotten the same thing. As adults, we often believe learning belongs mostly to younger years, school, college, training. But real learning does not end when formal education ends. In many ways, it becomes even more meaningful later in life. Because when we choose to learn as adults, we are not doing it because we are required to. We are doing it because we are curious, because we want to grow, because something inside us is still searching. A few months after that first class, I brought one of my paintings home and hung it on the living room wall. It was not perfect. Anyone with professional art training would probably notice many small mistakes. But to me, as that painting meant something important, it represented a moment when I chose possibility instead of hesitation, a moment when I chose curiosity instead of routine. And every time I looked at it, it reminded me of a simple truth. It is never too late to begin again, not just with painting, with anything. Learning a language, writing a story, traveling somewhere new, meeting new people, developing a skill you once believed belonged only to younger years. Life does not close these doors. Fear does, doubt does. The quiet voice that says, "It's too late." But that voice is not always telling the truth. Sometimes it is simply repeating an old habit of thinking, and habits can change. Today, when people hear that I started painting at 52, they sometimes say the same thing. I wish I had the courage to try something new like that. When they say this, I always smile, because the courage did not appear suddenly. It began with something very small, a moment of curiosity, a sign in a window, a single decision to walk through a door instead of walking past it. That small step did not just teach me how to paint, it changed the way I see the future. Instead of imagining the years ahead as a slow repetition of the past, I now see them as open space. space for learning, space for growth, space for experiences I have not yet imagined. And if you are listening to this story and wondering whether it might be too late for you to try something new, I want to leave you with the gentle thought. Maybe the most exciting chapter of your life is not behind you. Maybe it is simply waiting for the moment you decide to begin. Thank you for spending this quiet time listening. If this story brought you a moment of calm or inspiration, you are always welcome to return for more gentle English stories here. Until next time, take care of yourself and never forget that curiosity has no age.